Hello and welcome. Before we begin, today's program is available in French and Spanish. If you're watching today on our platform or via social media, please go to foreignpolicy.com/watch and click the register here button to access the Zoom webinar platform. If you're already on the Zoom webinar platform, or once you're here, you'll see an interpretation button below in your controls. Click that and choose the channel for the language you'd like to listen in. As an optional measure, click Mute Original Audio. I'll pause for a moment for those who wish to make that adjustment. Hello and welcome to today's FP Virtual Dialogue. This is the second in a series Foreign Policy has been hosting on how democracy can be uplifted around the world. Today's event takes a closer look at corrupt practices and the solutions needed in order to mitigate these forces. My name is Maggie Lake, and it's my pleasure to be your moderator this morning. Corruption has been a force that is increasingly prevalent in governments around the world. From reducing the rights of their own citizens to preventing the sharing of knowledge via limited or blocked access to the internet, to interfering across national borders in the elections of other countries, the world is witness to more examples of illiberal influences at play. In fact, Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index from 2021 shows that despite commitments, 131 countries have failed to make significant progress against corruption, with 2/3 having serious corruption problems. The COVID-19 pandemic has only served to create more opportunities for contract fraud, price gouging, counterfeit medicines, bribery related to tests, and more. A collaborative approach is needed to combat forces of corruption and illiberal influence around the world. When corruption thrives, democracy erodes. But through strategic partnerships between governments, civil society, nonprofits, and more, we can ensure that democracy remains strengthened across all borders. In fact, this is why the Biden administration has identified corruption, anti-corruption, as one of the three core pillars for the upcoming Summit for Democracy. Today's conversation reflects game changers who are leading the way in combating corruption. Before diving in, I'd like to extend a big thanks to the National Democratic Institute for helping us make this event possible. Now, some housekeeping. Before we get started, we want to make sure we can hear from you, our audience. We have hundreds of people tuned in and watching our live streams on social media. We've reserved a portion of this event for questions from our global audience. We want to hear from you. So here's how you can write to us. If you're on Zoom, click the Q&A button below and submit your questions. Please be sure to tell us your name, organization, and where you're writing from. If you're joining us on the phone or watching the live stream, you can email us your questions. The address is at foreignpolicy.com. And of course, we encourage you to chime in on social media as well. Be sure to use the hashtag Uniting Against Corruption. That's Uniting Against Corruption. All right, let's get started. We begin our program today with a conversation with Maria Ressa, a journalist, Nobel Peace Prize laureate, and the CEO of Rappler, the largest news website in the Philippines. Foreign Policy's editor-in-chief Ravi Agrawal interviewed Maria Ressa on FP Live, Foreign Policy's forum for live journalism. Maria is a living, breathing example of how one person can be a significant force in uniting others against corruption. She's faced endless challenges fighting for democratic values, such as freedom of the press. In fact, Rappler, the organization that Maria founded to combat disinformation and promote objective journalism, received the Madeleine K. Albright Democracy Award in 2017 from NDI. I'll turn it over now to Ravi and Maria.
Maria, welcome to the show.
Good to see you again, Ravi.
So let's start with the here and now. It's been, 6 years since Rodrigo Duterte came to power, promising to tackle poverty and corruption in the Philippines. His term recently ended, but he's remained a widely popular leader. As our readers know, his daughter was just elected vice president. All of this despite all the sexual abuse, human rights violations, allegations against him. He also ordered a violent crackdown on drugs that left tens of thousands of Filipinos dead. But Duterte wasn't only at war with the drug cartels, he was also at war with the press. He shut down the country's biggest broadcaster. Critics have been jailed. Maria, you yourself have faced relentless attacks, and Duterte ordered your media company Rappler to be shut down for allegedly violating foreign ownership rules. I know this case is ongoing, but catch us up to speed. Where do things stand right now?
Where do I begin? In less than 2 years, I've received 10 arrest warrants, right? So 10 criminal cases in less than 2 years. And just 2 days before the end of the Duterte administration, the SEC, like the US SEC, issued what is essentially a shutdown order. So 2 years earlier, in January 2018, the SEC tried to revoke our license to operate. We fought it frontally and fought it in court. We've carried it through the court, and now we're at the tail end. Imagine 2 days before the outgoing administration, they issue a shutdown order, which means technically they could, authorities now under the Marcos administration could shut Rappler down, despite the fact that we actually have more legal recourse. So it's very similar to the tactics that the Duterte administration took against more progressive, smaller websites, where they essentially just blocked them. The first time the Philippine government has blocked news groups, this was a week earlier than the shutdown order. And then, what they said is go to the courts, but the reality is that you're shut down. Having said that, here's the good news. We survived the Duterte administration. It is asymmetrical warfare. We're a very small group, but holding power to account actually does have its costs. But we as journalists, we held the line, Rob. We did what we were supposed to do. Now we ask the Marcos administration to restore rule of law. These charges are political. It is the very first time ever in the history of the Philippines that the SEC has moved this way, this quickly against, and the second point is, a news organization. Like in the United States, journalists are protected under the Bill of Rights. The Philippine Constitution is patterned after the US. So these attacks against press freedom, we need to call them out and to make sure that any of these movements have the light, happen in daylight.
And just so we all understand, why is the government trying to shut Rappler down?
I think this is, something that began in 2016. President Duterte, in his first State of the Nation address, attacked the largest newspaper. Within 2 weeks, that newspaper said that it was going to sell to a friend of the president. That sale didn't happen, but it's this kind of, death by 1,000 cuts, intimidation tactics. The second one you mentioned, the largest broadcaster, ABS-CBN, I headed that news group for 6 years. Their franchise was essentially taken away. Again, weaponization of the law. The way the government, the old administration, had gone after journalists was through the business. And this is exactly what's happening to us. Rappler was third, but the difference with Rappler is that we're journalists, right? In our shareholders agreement, there's actually a clause that gives not just editorial decisions to the journalists, but the business decisions. So we've really taken a hardline position. You move against freedom of the press, we will call out every single minute cut. It's death by 1,000 cuts of democracy.
And you travel around the world explaining these things and giving speeches. For journalists for editors and publishers who are being attacked by their governments, what is the advice you have for them? You said earlier you weren't scared. Some people are scared, and that also is understandable. What do they do? How do they respond? How do they fight back? How do they strengthen themselves?
Embrace your fear, right? That is a lesson I learned really young. But part of it is, how do you strengthen yourselves? Breaking news is the framework I look at everything from. When it is uncertain, when you don't know where the threat is coming from, you prepare for the worst, right? Because if you're ready for the worst, then you've already prepared both mentally, physically, and intellectually for anything else that leads you to the worst. So the first step is, I think, make sure that you are mentally prepared. Then the second is build your team. You have to make sure that your team understands what it is. And, here's what happened when the government attacked us. Rapplers are self-selective. All of the friction of a normal news organization kind of like fell away. And the mission, it is mission driven in the purest sense. And so there is an upside. This sounds crazy to say, right? We know this moment in time matters, not just for journalists, but for our societies. And I think that as early as 2016, we always would have general assemblies, GAs is what we call them, right? And at a certain point, like in 2018, when the government tried to revoke our license, I actually held a GA where I said, all right, we're moving to another phase. And, the median age in Rappler is 23 years old, so we're very young, right? So I said, I know some of your parents are not going to like this. If you don't want to be here, please just let us know and we will help you find another job. No one from editorial took that. And in fact, we had more people applying. I think do not underestimate that people understand the problem. So those two big ones, prepare for the worst, which means embrace your fear and communicate it with your entire organization, because that itself is a source of inspiration and power. And then the second thing is build your community. I don't think Rappler, aside from Rapplers themselves, it's also our community that allowed us to survive the 6 years of Duterte. Courage spreads in the same way that fear spreads. And it can be debilitating, but when you have your community with you, it's significant. We don't want to look back, and this is something I say to Rapplers all the time. We don't want to look back a decade from now and have regrets about what we've done. If the world moves to fascism, which, Ravi, this is where it's headed, right? Well, when that happens, I will know we will have done everything we can, not just as journalists, but as citizens of a democracy.
How do you keep going, Maria?
I really believe in this, Ravi. I mean, like I said, I have first-person experience of how your rights are torn away, how death by 1,000 cuts of a democracy happens. I have it both for my micro, and I see the macro in the data. That's the other part. That's what gives me a lot of courage. I can see the manipulation. The data shows it. And here's the last part for journalists. We need to embrace technology. We need to understand data. This is transforming the world. And this kind of, we don't have an internet of public interest. There is no internet that protects facts, that protects its users right now. It's like we're living in Mafiaville, where fraud. It's like let the buyer beware is the. But how do you protect against the insidious manipulation of the mind? Sorry, I didn't really answer your question, but part of it is, I guess this is the last part, which means you really shouldn't ever give up. The world is destroyed. The old world we knew is gone. Embrace that. If you know that, then what is this new world we're creating? Everyone today is creating that new world. How do we make it better despite all of this? So really, the first one is put those guardrails on the tech. God, enlighten self-interest. Do you really want to tear democracy apart? Do you really want to harm women and the most vulnerable of society? Because that is what's happening on social media.
Maria Ressa, thank you for joining us today. And that was Maria Ressa, the founder and CEO of Rappler, a top media organization in the Philippines. Ressa, of course, also a Nobel Peace Prize winner. I'm Ravi Agrawal, the editor-in-chief of Foreign Policy. As always, you can find these and other interviews on foreignpolicy.com/live. Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Wow, that was just incredible. That was just a short clip from the wide-ranging interview with Maria Ressa on FP Live. That's available only to FP subscribers. If you're not already a subscriber, please consider it. We'll send out additional details about upcoming programs and how to subscribe at a discount. If you are attending this event today, that'll be in our recap email tomorrow. Please email events@foreignpolicy.com for more information. Now, our next conversation convenes the leaders of organizations who are moving the needle globally on creating strategies to help mitigate and prevent corruption. I am delighted to welcome Dr. Delia Ferreira Rubio. She's the chair of Transparency International and based in Buenos Aires. Delia's career has spanned many of the major anti-corruption organizations around the world, and she's served as chief advisor to the Argentine National Congress. A lawyer by training, Delia is also the author of many publications on anti-corruption and transparency. Derek Mitchell is the president of the National Democratic Institute, or NDI. His appointment as NDI's third president comes after he served as the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of the Union of Myanmar from 2012 to 2016, the first ambassador to the country in 22 years. He has spent his career witnessing the link between democracy and international security. And Sanjay Pradhan is the CEO of the Open Government Partnership, or OGP. His work includes advising heads of states, ministers, and civil society organizations. A prolific speaker on governance and anti-corruption issues, Sanjay previously served as the Vice President of Leadership, Learning, and Innovation at the World Bank, along with a myriad of other distinguished roles. A very warm welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for being here today. And I don't know about you, but I already feel energized after listening to Maria. She has that effect on people. Derek, I'd like to start with you, if I may. And, corruption is a very broad term. And we heard Maria refer to some of the ways it can manifest. And I loved her comment, death by 1,000 cuts for democracy. And that's what it feels like to her in her fight. But I'd love to hear how you're defining it and the challenges that you're focused on at NDI.
Right. Well, first, I want to thank you, Maggie. Thank you for this. Thank you to Foreign Policy as president of NDI, just that hat, for the partnership in these game changer events. This is the third, and we have one more to come. It's been a very productive partnership, and I just want to thank my fellow panelists here. I want to thank Maria. I want to thank Ravi, Maggie, you, and everyone for joining this. The classical definition of corruption, I think the TI, Transparency International, says it's the use of public office for private gain. Which is a classical definition. I would define it more broadly, because corruption, gets to initiatives generally that debase or unnaturally change for the worse a system, institution, or even individuals themselves. So it's not simply narrow sort of public office private gain, but it's corrupting an entire system or institutions that are going on out there by liberals, both outside and inside countries. So we're focused on this threat pretty comprehensively at NDI. Democracy requires the equal and inclusive consideration of multiple voices and interests, and that policy decisions are based on national versus personal or private interests. None of our countries are perfect, but without that, as you stated at the top, the system corrodes. People get frustrated, people get angry, people get cynical, and that we've seen over and over again nowadays, where people have access to the technologies and they have a voice out there, and they can exchange views. It leads to rage, and you're seeing, because of the pandemic, you see the economic degradation from that. Haves get forward, the have-nots move back, and that just provides a huge opportunity for authoritarian opportunists to then accumulate power for themselves and say, only I can fix this problem. And the Philippines is a place like that. Tunisia, you see that, and to a great extent, the United States. So what we're about at NDI really is trying to look at this in a comprehensive way. We're not looking at it from a technocratic way. We look at it from a political perspective, which means working through legislatures, working through political parties comprehensively together, local government, civil society, media, to look at this. We can't do this by stovepipe. It has to be a concerted, collective effort of oversight and transparency, because without accountability, you have abuse of power. You just do. So what we do is really mainly preventative in that sense, but also centered on the partnerships internally and then externally with OGP, TI, and a host of folks to try to get a comprehensive strategy together to root this out and to promote certain norms, democratic norms in the international system to fight against what the illiberals are now doing, led by China and Russia, to shape an international system that accords to their illiberal, opaque, corrupt interests.
Yeah, Derek, when you talk about the rage, that the result is rage, I think that resonates with so many of us because we just feel that anger and frustration everywhere. Delia, Transparency International has over 100 chapters around the world. I'm curious, what's the most pressing challenge from your vantage point, and who's most at risk?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation for FP and NDI. It's a pleasure to be with Derek and Sanjay and you, Maggie. And of course, the situation is not the same in all the countries in the world, and we work in many countries around the world, as you have said. But there are certain common factors in corruption. And we have to start by saying that corruption has many faces. This abuse of entrusted power for private gain is not just a financial crime, because the private gain can assume very different aspects. Corruption is the local public servant asking for a bribe in exchange of a service. It is the university professor asking for sex in exchange of grades. It is also the minister asking for a kickback in order to assign a contract. It is also manipulating elections. It is also using or selling your decision power, or selling your votes in contract, or buying votes from the people. And it is also using corrosive capitals as a geopolitical tool, as a strategic corruption tool in order to manipulate foreign governments. So corruption is very, very much complicated. What we have seen in the last years is that it has become more sophisticated. New actors have come in the scenery, for instance, organized crime trying to influence politics. We have also the illegal or arbitrary use, and Maria was talking about that, of technology in order to suppress liberties or weaken accountability and suppress transparency. So the problem is global. The money that is stolen in the countries perceived as corrupt in the index, for instance, you have mentioned, ends in the City of London, the real estate industry in New York, the luxury industry in Paris, or the art market in Geneva, or in some countries that are now open arms receiving the oligarchs that has moved from the countries that have applied sanctions because of the war. So it is a global problem. That's why no sector can fight it alone. We need collective action here, governments, international organizations, citizens, and of course, the business sector. And we have to work together to restore the principles that Derek was mentioning, the basic standards, accountability, freedoms, rule of law, which are the victims of corruption around the world. Not only individuals, our societies are the victims of corruption.
Yeah.
Marie, system is a victim.
Delia, you bring up a good point. And Sanjay, I think, as I'm listening to Delia lay out, the food chain, not just the perpetrators, but those on the receiving end of the long line of the, the gains of corruption. And then I think about Maria talking about the weaponization of law. I mean, in some ways, this can be nuanced. It's not always as straightforward as something like bribery. It can get complex and sophisticated. How are you looking at the corruption landscape, and are the challenges shifting, Sanjay?
This is being weaponized in new ways. We are looking at new manifestations of the problem. But the reality is, so the way we are seeing it, to answer your question, Maggie, we are seeing both good news and bad news. The bad news we are seeing in terms of how you framed this session is that corruption is both fueling the rise of illiberal autocrats, and in turn, autocrats are fueling corruption. So that's the bad news. I'll come to the good news. So just to explain the bad news a bit further and link it to what Derek and Delia said, a key driver from our perspective has been plummeting citizen trust in government. If you look at the Edelman barometer, citizen trust in government had already plummeted to an all-time low before the pandemic, and it has continued to drop. Now, this citizen distrust is in fact that rage that Derek was talking about. In far too many countries, citizens perceive their governments to be disconnected, corrupt, or captured from their interests. Now, what has happened is that populists have stoked this distrust, this rage, to ask for power, rise to power, and then use their power to attack oversight institutions, media, and so on, in the way that Maria very articulately espoused. So that's the link between corruption, distrust, and the rise of these elected autocrats. And on the reverse side, once they are in power, they're using secrecy, they're using their amassed wealth to hide illegal wealth in anonymous companies in the West, as Delia was saying. So you're seeing this vicious circle, a two-way loop, if you will, which we are. So that's the bad news. The good news I wanted to say from our perspective is that even though we see these same problems mirrored across our 77-country partnership, we are also seeing simultaneously courageous reformers rising up and taking a stance, like we saw from Maria Ressa. But in our open government partnership, we are seeing that courageous reformers from government and civil society, in that collaborative sense that Derek and Delia spoke about, are advancing reforms that tackle this. And let me just tell you very quickly, we are seeing 30 OGP governments, from Slovakia to Nigeria, where I'm heading this weekend, to UK and Slovakia, improving beneficial ownership registers to end anonymous companies, which are being used to stash the illegal and ill-gotten wealth of these autocrats. So we have 30 countries. If this could become a global norm in the way that Derek was talking about, we could put an end to this. We are seeing 70 OGP governments doing open contracting, which is that these procurement contracts, which are the way to give collusive deals in corrupt backroom deals, Ukraine, which is now under attack in Russia, actually was a pioneer in this before it got attacked. It actually put all this corrupt backroom deals in open platform where all citizens could see these contracts and report violations. 70 OGP governments are emulating this. If we can make these things a global norm, they're not right now, but we have positive, good news also. If we can scale this up and expand the coalitions, we can actually make a difference.
And can I say something on this as
well? Please.
What's very important here, I think people are waking up to the challenge now, which is very important. You have to understand and recognize the problem first, and people are now recognizing it and waking up to the challenge. So it's understanding that these contracts are being done, and then working with parliaments, civil society, media, and others to be informed on how these contracts are done, how illiberal nations typically operate, how maybe kleptocrats within their own government tend to operate, understand what these contracts say, demand the access to the contracts, learn how to read them, learn how to understand how they're written. And then as Sanjay says, require all nations to follow norms for how you operate in these countries, for investment and for assistance. So it really is about understanding and recognizing first, and then learning about, okay, how do I understand what I'm seeing? It's not just getting the contract, but learning what's in there and how to adjust it and provide appropriate oversight.
Yes, Delia, I know you want to jump in. I do want to ask one question, because we want to hear from the audience, and I want to start to pull some of them in now. We've got some great comments coming in. And Derek, to that point, I think when you think about something like this, it can seem so overwhelming of how one person can make a change. But we have a question from Fernando. How do we deal with corruption when it's culturally accepted, tolerated, or ignored? And I think that is always the challenge, when it just seems pervasive. How are you thinking about that, addressing it, especially when it comes to really understanding what's going on, understanding these contracts, understanding the nature of what you're up against?
If I may, I was just going to mention that point because I have seen the question. And I think that the citizens' tolerance or normalization of corruption is one of the problems, because it's a window of opportunity for the corrupt. If there is no consequences, neither from the judiciary, because Maria said very well, go to the courts. But in some countries, judiciary is not independent. It's also captured by the same corrupt networks. So you cannot go there in order to really get protection for your rights. But if people start to think, well, in this country, this is the way we run our lives, that's an opportunity for corruption. So laws and institutions and agencies are needed, but they are not enough. And just awareness of or disclosure or access to information is not enough. We need to resource those institutions, to apply those laws, and to have the people involved. When we, in our global barometer, ask people, are you ready to fight, or do you believe that citizens can make a difference? 70% of the people around the world say, yes, we believe that citizens can make a difference. But then you ask, can you really do that in your country without the fear of retaliation or violence, or even putting your life in risk? And that's the problem. And that's why it is a combined effort. We need more information, we need more integrity, we need less impunity, and we need less indifference.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well put. Sanjay, we have a question. I think that when we're looking at transparency, we understand it's a necessary step, shining a light as we try to move, combat corruption, move toward integrity, but it's not enough on its own. And we have a comment from Buwan Podell, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, about corruption in the third world. We're all aware that part of the world corruption is apparent, whether it's small or mismanagement on the part of governance. People of vested interest involved in politics use public policy to their benefit. Private sectors, though, are also not transparent and fair in terms of their influence in policy. How can we address such challenges in the third world? I think really speaking to, and I'm paraphrasing the question slightly, but speaking to the importance of transparency, not only on a governmental level, but in the private sector, and how can we translate that into accountability?
Yeah, so it takes two to tango. And, the fact is that you have corruption from the government, and you have the recipient, and then the private sector is doing this. You need both of them to be held accountable, and you need the private sector in it. The example I was giving of open contracting or beneficial ownership transparency, both of them require government to be making transparent the contracts or the company ownership, and the private sector to join in making these things open as well. But the deeper and the broader point I wanted to link to what the previous question was and what Delia was saying is that when you have endemic corruption, or what the previous question was saying, you feel this sense of helplessness and hopelessness because society is corrupt, everywhere cultural norms accept corruption. I'm like a fierce optimist and a fighter in this. And I think that's why we find so much energy in people like Maria Ressa. You cannot let that sense of nihilism prevail. The key point is that no society, no government is monolithically all corrupt. You see real pockets of resistance. You see real pockets of activism. And the frontier of fighting corruption is to energize and connect these lonely reformers so that they find collective strength. Maggie, you mentioned Maria shows that what difference an individual can make. And indeed, she shows that. I can give you one example, a personal one. My father was a fighter of corruption in India's most corrupt state. He was a lonely reformer. He was harassed and threatened and yet prevailed. But the key point now is we can't let lonely reformers fight this battle alone. We need to connect them so they find collective strength and courage from one another so that they overturn this pervasive, helpless, hopeless sense. That's what OGP is. It's an alliance of reformers from government, civil society, parliaments, private sector. We need to connect them so that coalitions of integrity overcome corrupt networks of corruption. For those of you who remember Montesinos in Peru, intelligence officer, and there was a videotaped cases of him accepting and giving bribes on Fujimori's behalf. It was a massive entrenched network of corruption. You need coalitions of integrity to fight against this. And that's why forums like this are important. Multi-stakeholder platforms are important. So you connect these lonely reformers so they find collective inspiration and strength to find corruption.
And they need the partnership with governments, as we talk about norms. They need the partnerships with those around the world who can help set those norms. So, I mean, what the people need is a sense that there's an alternative. I completely agree with Sanjay that what autocrats want to do always is to make people feel like there's just no hope. Just give up, just submit. And so that's why they try to suppress free speech, and try to suppress anybody who has any hope or tries to make change. But if you give people a sense that there are alternatives, change their expectations that things can be different. I think that it's not acceptable in almost any country, corruption. There's a kind of low level, maybe acceptance culturally, but once it reaches a certain level, I think all societies say it's too much and it leads to desire for change. And what if they can network at their level, at the grassroots level, but also get support from the international community that's setting certain norms, people get a sense of the possible. You give people a sense of the possible, and that really accelerates, I think, potential for change.
So Derek, give us something tangible. You know, what are some of the steps NDI is taking to mitigate the effects of corrupt practices, especially when we're looking at this foreign sponsored kind of strategic corruption that is daunting?
Right. Well, it is about, as I say, it's so the oversight and accountability efforts that we try and do in countries. So whether it's working in Colombia or in Bosnia or in Albania on political finance oversight to make sure that financing of political campaigns is done in a certain way, that people are able to understand the contracts from liberal actors externally, that they can take account, understand how, say, China operates in closed systems, to try to subvert free speech and norms, and also working again with our government and other governments and with technology companies about appropriate regulatory systems that promote democratic values and openness and not opacity and suppression of speech and propagation of disinformation. And we do that working with what we call civic tech organizations on the tech side. In Taiwan, we did, in Ukraine and elsewhere, to look at, and this helps actually in America, where we are able to partner on techniques to how do you overcome disinformation in your society? What works in your local context? Because Taiwan's done an effective job, Ukraine's done a pretty good job of late, Estonia's done a good job, others have done a good job. So we're trying to link together those communities of practice around the world that are grappling with this in their local conditions, local situations. Trying to inject again some energy and some ideas into that, and then build these communities as we can to take on both the national and the international challenge that we're facing.
Delia, technology is an interesting point here, because when I think about these partnerships that Derek talks about and the coalition of integrity that Sanjay talks about, I can think about using technology to empower that, to fuel that. But on the other hand, I know you've really focused for many years, and we're very early calling out the dangers of technology that can be used as a tool for corruption. So talk to me a little bit about the role of technology.
Of course, technology is a great tool, but it is a tool. All kinds of machine learning mechanisms or tools are tools. They can be used for good and evil. And we have to make very clear that the risks are there. this is a new power, and we have to hold this power to account and to make it transparent and to make it working according to ethical standards in order not to attack or undermine rights and autonomy of people. So technology has been used for instance, as Sanjay mentioned, the disclosure and openness of contracting. That's great, given information. You can use technology, for instance, in countries where the corrupt problem is land grabbing, and use blockchain technologies to support the registers, the land registers, to guarantee that people's property is protected and are not victim of fraud or deprivation. That's great, but blockchain, the same technology, is in the basis of cryptocurrencies, and cryptocurrencies are created to protect anonymity of the owners, and the traditional follow the money solution in order to know, for instance, who is financing a candidate or a party, with cryptocurrencies is much more complicated, because the same tool can be used for two things. So we can use, for instance, big data analytics or machine learning tools to detect money laundering patterns, suspicious patterns, that will alert the authorities in order to investigate that. But also machine learning tools can be biased, can have discriminatory elements within them, and we cannot discover that without transparency of the algorithms. What we cannot do, because technology is here to stay and it is welcome, what we cannot do is to delegate decision-making power in machines or in artificial intelligence tools, because that's algocracy, the government by algorithms. And we discussed the other day with you, Maggie, and the panelists, the example of the exams in UK when during the pandemic time, and the grades were given by algorithms, not by teachers. And there was a great mess. And people took the streets with banners saying, I'm not going to reproduce, but with banners against the algorithms, because the algorithms have taken the decision. In many countries, artificial intelligence tools are used to determine who receives a subsidy, who receives a credit. In companies, some of these tools are deciding who is offered a job position. We have to be very, very careful. And this is the conversation that the UNESCO is taking into account, the European Union is taking into account.
Right.
We need proper regulation in order to protect the rights, the freedoms, and also the space for civic activity.
One of the things I love about this conversation is that we're not just defining the problem, but also trying to point to the optimism, the possibility, and the solutions. And so with that in mind, Derek, as we sort of begin to wrap up here, and we have so many questions, we're not going to get to all of them, but I hope we'll find a way to try to get them to you afterwards so that you can follow up, because a lot of people want to find connections, find out more information, and continue the conversation. So thrilled to do that if your question doesn't get in. But if I could, Derek, with a solution sort of mindset, ask you this very, I think, simple question from Michael Ghetto. How can government anti-corruption agencies work against corrupt behavior? How can they effectively hold government and parliamentary officials to account? How can they be empowered?
Well, first of all, they have to be empowered. They have to be connected to a judiciary and a rule of law system that truly empowers them. It's not enough to simply establish an institution that says anti-corruption and then have them twist in the wind, where they're not tethered to the formal, levers of power in the country. I think that's number one. You see that a lot of places around the world. I mean, I think Ukraine, there were various commissions, but it didn't necessarily have impact. But you've got to, you've got to, first of all, recognize the problem, and you've got to get buy-in from the leadership of the country. You've got to get buy-in from by the elected leaders. You've got to get oversight within Parliament. You've got to get partnerships with civil society. You've got to have open hearings. You've got to allow for accountability if there are big dogs, as we might call them, big oligarchs or such, who are corrupt. You have to make an example, so it's not just going after the little guy, but the big guy in the process. Otherwise, people will see it as simply another way of going after political opponents or political enemies. It's very, very hard. There's no silver bullet to any of this. I mean, there's no, even amidst the optimism you may hear, or the sense of possibility, it takes a thorough societal and political commitment at some risk. It takes really strong leadership, and it really takes inspiration from the international community to put that pressure on and to hold ourselves to account for our part in this. In fact, if we're hosting banks and finance in our countries, we've got to put that all together in order to make a real difference.
The message I'm hearing from all of you, and Sanjay, very, very quickly.
I just wanted to say that we need to broaden this notion, and Derek has answered very well on anti-corruption agencies. We broaden this notion of auditors to citizen auditors. And I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of this partnership between government reformers and citizen auditors. In the height of the pandemic, where these massive relief funds for COVID were launched, Colombia created a mobile app where it disclosed all the COVID-19 spending as open data and empowered citizens on a mobile app to monitor the COVID funds and report violations. We have a case study of Jimmy, 22-year-old, who found that the most needy were not getting it, and it actually reported it and led to responses in Ukraine. And I do want to, on my side, end with Ukraine, because we can find inspiration from a country at war, because it did inspire reforms where all these open contracts that Delia talked about empowered citizens to actually report violations. In 2 years, citizens reported 14,000 violations because of these open contracts where citizens could report violations. The government reported saving $1 billion. 82% of the private sector surveyed reported reduced corruption. And there was a 50% increase in small and medium enterprises bidding for contracts because they felt it was an open, level playing field. We need to get inspiration from these, where there is an alliance between government reformers and citizens, so that you get this coalition going, and definitely factor in citizens as agents of change to hold the governments to account, citizen auditors, not just formal state auditors.
Sanjay, I'm glad you brought that up, because it touched on several different questions we had from the audience. And I'm hearing collaboration is key to progress. And I'll leave you all with an optimistic note. One of the questions that we had was, what can young people do to get involved? And I think that is incredibly important and inspirational to hear that. So many, as I said, we've got to end it there, but so many people asking for more information, how to get involved, how to find examples. So we will share ways to get in touch with all of these fantastic panelists so that you can continue this conversation and get the information you need to bring home to the part of the world you're listening to. So thank you so much, Sanjay, Delia, and Derek, for the work you're doing and for sharing your insights today. I wish we had more time with you. We'll have to come back and do it again.
Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you very much. Everybody. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Well, for our next conversation, I was honored to sit down with Richard Nephew, the coordinator for the global anti-corruption with the U.S. State Department. Richard is the first person to serve in this newly created position, and this was his first public appearance since assuming the role. Let's jump in. Richard, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Oh, thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you.
And this is a new role for you. You were named as the coordinator on global anti-corruption by Secretary of State Blinken earlier this month. So I'd like to spend some time on your background and past experience. You've been with the Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation, and then the National Security Council as the Director for Iranian Affairs before moving on to lead sanctions policy. And interestingly, you most recently have also been at the Center on Global Energy Policy. So I'm wondering how does all of this experience inform the way that you're planning to lead the State Department focus on anti-corruption?
Well, again, thanks very much for having me. And I should note at the outset, this is one of my first public events as coordinator as well. So it's a privilege to share this opportunity and this time with you. I should say at the outset, of course, while I've been asked to serve as coordinator, I have to acknowledge all the tremendous work that's already going on here and the team that I'm joining, both here within my own office, within the State Department, and the broader U.S. government. I recognize that the anti-corruption mission has been a central piece of the U.S. government's agenda for quite some time, and that there are a lot of folks who work day in and day out to try and address this scourge. And I'm just very honored to be asked to join them. I think my job, which is a new role in and of itself, it was just announced by the Secretary back in December, is to complement the work that these great folks are doing by adding a little bit of additional connectivity, perhaps, with the senior-most levels of our government, and then trying to integrate them both within the department and outside of it because of the pernicious threat of corruption and the challenge that it presents. And I think my past work, has a couple of different areas in which I can bring some things to bear. First, as you mentioned, I spent a lot of time working on nonproliferation. Well, it's been a lot of hands-on nonproliferation. So I've been spending a lot of time, chasing down and running down, the networks that are engaged in illicit trade and financial activity. That effectively means that I've been engaged in the effort to go after illicit finance for over 15 years as well. And, you can see that there's a lot of different overlaps between the kinds of activities that people engage in for nonproliferation and the kinds of things that people engage in, with respect to corruption. Second, I've spent a lot of time working with international partners, frankly, to deal with tough issues that require tough conversations. And I think one of the things that I've already been asked to do is to be prepared to have some of those tough conversations and to ask partners to make sacrifices, to take tough choices, and to deal with tough problems. And so I'm looking forward to getting out there and working with governments that are confronting some of these challenges and seeing what we can do to assist them. I've also spent a lot of time building new organizations here at the State Department, but folding them into existing activities. The coordinator's office was working on sanctions policy, which was something the U.S. government had been doing for quite some time. Working as deputy envoy for Iran was working on Iran policy, which had been done for a long time, but trying to add additional layers and connectivity. And so I think that the key thing I'll take from that is the need to not reinvent the wheel, to be able to work within the existing systems and with folks who are already doing a lot of this work. And the last, you mentioned the Center on Global Energy Policy. I've also spent a fair amount of time dealing with private industry as well in the private sector. And I'll just say, it all leads me to believe that there's a lot out there that's outside of government walls that can be tapped into. And I think fora such as this and other international fora that bring in outside experts are critical to informing us what we're doing right, what we're doing wrong, and to give us the kind of steers that we need. So I'll be looking to tap into that in this role.
Yeah. The fact that it's a new position obviously speaks to the priority, the understanding of the severity of the problem, but it's a broad one, isn't it? As you just pointed out, it kind of cuts across so many different areas. As the newly minted coordinator, what are the first steps that you're envisioning as a way to combat corruption, both within our borders and also globally?
Yeah, I mean, fortuitously, we're in a position here where we're getting to implement a very thoughtful and thorough document that was developed by the administration over the course of the last year and announced back in December, the U.S. strategy on countering corruption. There is a lot in there, and there's a lot of good data as well as a lot of good objectives that have been already articulated that gives us a pretty aggressive agenda that we're going to follow. And there's also been a number of international events as well, such as the first Summit for Democracy in December, in which there were over 900 commitments made, many of which deal with anti-corruption. So my first priority, my job is going to be, looking at the implementation of the strategy to ensure that we're championing and elevating those efforts that are within the strategy when it makes sense to do so, that we're undertaking these activities in an integrated way, and that we as a department are advancing this agenda. And I think, there are three things that are going to be an immediate priority. First, we'll be engaging directly with foreign governments to help address corruption issues. And as I mentioned, there's a lot of tough conversations that are going to be involved there. And I'm looking forward to getting out there and to working with governments that are struggling with this challenge, to partnering with them and to finding ways in which we can help them tackle this problem. Second, we're going to be reaching out to civil society and private sector counterparts to get their perspectives, to get their candid feedback, to learn and share best practices and explore ways we can collaborate to advance our shared interests in combating corruption globally. And then third, as I said, we're looking internally, within the State Department to continue highlighting what we're doing right to take a hard look at areas where we can do more and work within the institution to incorporate anti-corruption as a key part of diplomacy. And of course, that's going to have reverberations in terms of working with the rest of the U.S. government, with Congress, and all the other parts of the USG that are involved in this challenge.
Mm. So it sounds like a very much a listening tour. And would you say the Biden administration policy against corruption is under review? Are we in the middle of sort of reprioritizing it, or is there a larger position that's articulated?
No, I think that the president has made abundantly clear that this is a priority. You know, he's raised this to the level of a national security priority and national security challenge. It's contained in the national security guidance that was originally issued when he came into office. It's been reiterated time and time again that the president sees this as a national security issue and a priority. So I think at this point, it's a listening tour for the moment to try and figure out where we can best add value and where we can complement the efforts that are already underway. But it's very much also going to shift into an active mode of implementing those pieces of the agenda that have already been laid out and where some additional effort could be brought to bear.
Mm. Anti-corruption mitigation is not a new concept at all. The U.S. has been witnessing various levels of corruption, influence on election tampering, cyber attacks. I mean, it's in the headlines constantly. From your perspective, what's been lacking in terms of truly trying to address the problem, and how is your role set to remedy that?
Yeah, I think you're right to point out that we're not immune to corruption here in the United States. Corruption is a global problem, and it's one that we have to approach with humility, especially with engaging with other countries. I have from practical experience a number of discussions in which governments say, yeah, but how good are you at dealing with these various different problems, and wanting to talk about sanctions evasion or talking about proliferation threats and similar. And corruption is going to be no different. I think the headlines are going to continue to demonstrate that we've got our own challenges. So the first thing is that you have to be, direct. You have to be honest about the own challenges that you have. And this administration has not been shy at all about putting ourselves under the microscope to see where we're succeeding in the fight against corruption and where we're falling short. We're a proud member, active participant, and leader in a variety of peer review processes at the UN, OAS, OECD, and the Financial Action Task Force. That's where we're being evaluated by others to see where we have challenges and where we can make progress. And we believe that those sorts of efforts are a key part of the anti-corruption mission. And it highlights the answer to your question of what's been lacking: political will. It's the political will to prioritize this as a challenge, to make tough choices, and to put this at the center of foreign policy or center of domestic policy if you're dealing with the domestic challenges. I think that's where this administration and this president have been very direct, very honest, very open, and very blunt that corruption is a threat. It's a threat that needs to be dealt with in a very direct and aggressive fashion. And we can already see in cases like Russia and other places around the world where if you let those threats continue to persist, bigger problems, bigger national security challenges can emerge. So I think that the key point is that the political will to deal with this problem earnestly and directly at the outset is what has been lacking and what this administration is setting right.
Yeah, you mentioned the situation with Ukraine. I mean, we're looking at what's taking place there. We see difficulties and strife popping up in places like Sri Lanka. How are you dealing with the interference of other countries? What are the steps that you're hoping to take to keep these bad actors accountable, whether they're governments themselves or groups within countries?
Yeah, we've got a variety of tools that we both can and will use to deal with these challenges. First and foremost, when we identify that there are champions for anti-corruption missions in various different countries around the world, we're going to elevate them. We're going to give them attention. We're going to give them support. And that includes by directly identifying people. There's the Anti-Corruption Champion Program that has now had a couple of different announcements made about people who are anti-corruption champions, as well as kind of more systemic efforts where we have a variety of programs that are being designed to aid those who are attempting to do the right thing in their governments, either by helping with law enforcement efforts, improving rule of law institutions, helping build legislation, so on and so forth. And that work is not being done out of the coordinator's office, to be direct. It's being done by program offices throughout the State Department, USAID, and elsewhere that are all integrally involved in this effort. My role is going to be making sure governments out there know those programs are available, know that they can avail themselves of them. And of course, there's then the other piece, which is the use of coercive instruments. This administration's been very clear that it's prepared to use sanctions tools and others to go after those who are engaged in corruption activity. I've participated in the development of the Magnitsky Act implementation sanctions in my previous role. GLOMAG, the Global Magnitsky Act, has got a central pillar being anti-corruption. And those are the sorts of authorities the administration is going to use, as well as to work with other partners to build their own authorities to do the same thing abroad. So we've got both sets of tools, and we're going to be robust in using both.
So, from a diplomatic perspective, it's often a fine line to walk between working with regimes of other countries that have been prolific, in corrupt activities. Again, we see, or examples are cited, whether it's China or Russia. As representative of the State Department, how do you, tackle the corruption element while also ensuring that communications with countries are maintained? And it's almost impossible to make everyone happy on that front. You hear the criticism constantly on that. How do you walk that balance?
Well, look, as I said at the outset, one of the reasons why they may have asked me to take on this job is that I've had a lot of tough conversations with a lot of tough, customers, and I'm I think inclined to do the same here. That means having direct conversations where we see a corruption challenge, whether it is a domestic one or one that is being facilitated by a foreign government, and to say this is a problem. It's not just a problem for the United States, it's a problem for the international system and international stability as a whole. But I think you highlight something that we're going to do here in the State Department, which is to mainstream anti-corruption as part of the foreign policy agenda. I'm not going to be alone in making this point about anti-corruption being critical. It's something that the Secretary has committed he is going to do. He's demonstrated that commitment through multiple different conversations he's had, as well as public events, and certainly all the way down through the State Department's administration, as well as the rest of the government. There is a commitment to elevate anti-corruption as part of the agenda. So when we're talking to governments, we are going to include this in every discussion that makes sense. And we're going to say, look, this is not just something that we care about because we're the United States. We're here to lecture you. Again, we're approaching this with humility, but we're going to, say this is a threat to us all. It threatens international peace, international stability, international economic development. This is a challenge that needs to be dealt with. And I think if we take that kind of honest, direct, open, and transparent approach to it, we're going to receive some benefits. Now, of course, if we find that there are challenges that are not managed through direct diplomacy, as I said, we have other tools to try and address that as well. But I think at the first instance, our objective is to use those diplomatic conversations to the extent possible to advance the goals, as has been the cornerstone of this administration's foreign policy.
Secretary Blinken's announcement included the launch of a U.S. strategy on countering corruption. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, the U.S. strategy for counter-corruption is really an impressive document. And I say this as someone who has spent a lot of time in my career reading U.S. government strategy documents. Look, some of them can be pretty boring. Some of them can be pretty dry. Some of them can be pretty redundant. But if you actually take the time to read through the strategy, it's amazing how many different levels of activity are already identified as underway and new areas that need to be built upon. It's a document that takes a broad approach. It tries to integrate the intelligence gathering apparatus, law enforcement apparatus, the diplomatic apparatus, sanctions, and so forth. And so the strategy itself outlines a whole range of activities, both positive and potentially those that are a little bit more coercive, that can be done to advance the anti-corruption mission. And it also identifies the fact that we're going to do a lot of work here too. And I'll keep coming back to it. The fact is the United States has its own corruption challenges, and we are committed to working on those challenges, both as an administration as well as with Congress. And you can see that through a number of different legislative pieces that are being considered on Capitol Hill, discussions that are happening in civil society. There's a lot of attention here, and the strategy attempts to channel all of that towards the aim of putting anti-corruption at the forefront of national security policymaking.
Interesting. It sounds like you're really trying to break down the silos that have existed, and I would argue are always a challenge in Washington, and really take a holistic approach to this, understanding that it cuts across so many different areas. How are you thinking about this in the lead up to the Summit on Democracy?
Yeah, you're exactly right. This is an exercise in breaking down those silos and making sure that people, first and foremost, have the information they need to be able to make decisions and to be able to execute their programs, to make sure that they get the support that they need, to make sure that they have the ability to channel things up to senior leadership. And I think the effort of my office is going to be to ensure that all those efforts are coordinated, that we are in a position to get this information to senior leaders so that they know what they need to know about what we can do, what we might want to do but can't yet do if we don't have appropriations or we don't have legislative vehicles, and to be able to identify and close those gaps that may emerge. I think, of course, the other piece of this, and this relates directly to the summit, is the need to implement some of those 900 commitments that I was mentioning earlier. We've got a lot of different things that governments have already signed on to do, and now we need to work with them to try and help implement all of those various different commitments, to find where there are problems and challenges that they're having. And so over the course of the next several weeks, months, me and my team are going to travel. We're going to meet with foreign governments. We're going to meet with international organizations. We're going to identify those places where implementation is flagging, where they could use additional help or additional ideas. And then we're going to do our best to try and apply the resources that we have to it. And as I said at the outset, the fact that we've got the support of the president, we have the support of the secretary, is going to make that job a lot easier. And so, again, it's worth just noting the fact that this strategy exists, the political will exists to take on this challenge, that's a large piece of the battle. And I think we're going to get real benefits as a result.
Well, Richard, certainly a lot of work to be done, but we appreciate you taking the time. Congratulations on the new role, and please come back and keep us updated.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
That was Richard Nephew. Today's conversation has been enlightening and revealing in what will truly take to preserve democracy and ensure that corruptive forces are kept at bay. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Join us in September as we continue the conversation on how we can defend democracy. Today was the first of many programs we have coming up. Join FP for the full conversation with Maria Ressa, which will launch this Friday at noon. As I mentioned, this is a subscriber benefit that you can learn more about in the email that you'll receive from Foreign Policy. And on September 16th, we are convening a virtual dialogue looking at how to establish resiliency around the globe. This is one of many convenings Foreign Policy will be hosting around the UN General Assembly, so stay tuned for more programming. And of course, a big thanks again to the National Democratic Institute for supporting this project. Stay tuned for updates and find out more at foreignpolicy.com. Take care, and we'll see you soon.